The first sound Lev Borisovich noticed in the camp was the echo of a scream that never arrived. He had opened his mouth to shout when the guard pushed him forward, but what came out was only air. No voice. No rasp. The scream stayed inside his chest, vibrating there like a trapped animal, and the silence swallowed it whole. Later he would remember this moment more clearly than his arrest, the train, or the weeks in transit. Silence, he would come to understand, was not the absence of sound here. It was a construction. The gates closed behind him without a clang. Someone had padded them. Snow absorbed the footsteps. Orders were given with gestures, glances, the tilt of a chin. The camp existed in the far north, at the end of the 1930s, in a place where maps ended and certainty dissolved. Officially, the construction site did not exist. Officially, either did the men who worked there. Lev Borisovich had once designed concert halls. He believed sound followed laws. He believed the world, when examined closely enough, revealed patterns that could be measured and improved. This belief had survived his denunciation, his trial, and even the sentence pronounced in a voice so bored it sounded almost kind. It began to fracture the first night in the barracks, when he realized that the absence of noise was deliberate. Men coughed into sleeves. Boots were removed slowly, placed rather than dropped. Even breathing felt regulated. When someone spoke too loudly in their sleep, he was not struck. He was moved. The next morning his bunk was empty, and no one asked where he had gone. The first interrogation lasted an entire day. Lev Borisovich sat under a lamp that hummed faintly, the only sound in the room. The investigator leafed through papers, adjusted his pen, folded his hands, and waited. No questions were asked. When Lev Borisovich began to explain who he was, what he had done, why the accusations were impossible, the investigator raised a finger. Silence returned, heavier than before. By the end of the day Lev Borisovich would have confessed to anything, but there was nothing to confess to. The crime changed daily. One day it was sabotage. The next day it was ideological deviation. The day after that, failure to report thoughts inconsistent with socialist realism. He learned quickly that logic did not protect him. It exposed him. In the second month he was summoned somewhere warm. The room had a stove, a table, and a man who smiled. The man knew Lev Borisovich's profession. He spoke with genuine curiosity about acoustics, about the way sound shaped human behavior. He did not accuse. He invited. The camp, the man explained, was experimental. Physical punishment was inefficient. It broke bodies but produced unreliable results. What they needed was understanding. Why did men break? How could resistance be dissolved without leaving marks? Lev Borisovich was to help articulate this scientifically. Refusal, the man added gently, would not be punished directly. It would merely require adjustments to the labor schedule of Barracks 12. Barracks 12 contained men who had shared bread with Lev Borisovich. One had shown him how to wrap rags around his boots. Another had whispered jokes that made no sound but still made people smile. Lev Borisovich asked for paper. He told himself he would write neutrally. Objectively. He described silence as a stimulus. He described uncertainty as an amplifier. He avoided words like cruelty. He used phrases like cognitive overload and anticipatory stress. He included footnotes about thresholds, about the danger of collapse leading to uselessness. These were his first acts of sabotage, though he did not yet call them that. The reports circulated. Guards changed their routines. Interrogations became quieter. Longer. More refined. Lev Borisovich felt ill when he realized his words had power. He also noticed that some prisoners lasted longer. They learned to count breaths. To invent sounds in their heads. To survive the gaps. At night he listened. Silence was never complete. There was always a distant wind, a crack of ice, the faint hum of generators feeding the non-existent project. He began to map these sounds mentally, building an internal architecture no one could take from him. The third act of his imprisonment began when a young guard approached him after lights out and slid a folded paper onto his bunk. It was a copy of one of his reports, rewritten by hand. Certain lines were underlined. In the margins someone had added symbols, pauses, arrows. A code. Others had understood. From then on Lev Borisovich wrote differently. He introduced ambiguity intentionally. He praised methods that required restraint. He warned against overuse of silence, citing imaginary data. He constructed sentences that could be read as endorsement, or as caution. The machine accepted this. Machines always did. But machines also optimized. One morning he was summoned again to the warm room. This time there were two men. They congratulated him. His work had been noticed. He was to be rewarded. There would be a lecture, delivered by him, to educate senior guards. A demonstration of corrected thinking. After that, release. Release was a word he had stopped allowing himself to imagine. Now it returned poisonous and sweet. He asked for time. They gave him a night. That night the barracks felt louder than ever. Every breath was an accusation. He realized with sudden clarity that freedom offered under these conditions was not freedom. It was conscription. If he accepted, his voice would become another tool. If he refused, others would pay. In the end he chose a third thing. The lecture hall was full. He stood at the podium and read the approved text. He spoke of errors. Of youthful arrogance. Of the necessity of alignment. But he controlled the rhythm. He inserted pauses where they should not be. He emphasized words that changed meaning when isolated. To the guards it sounded dull. To those trained by silence, it was screaming. He was released 3 days later. His papers were stamped. His name vanished from the camp registry, as if it had never been there. Years passed. In another decade, in another frozen place, a new prisoner received a thin manual titled Guidelines for Psychological Regulation in Isolated Labor Environments. He read it by dim light. Near the end he stopped. There was a sentence that made no sense unless read twice. Then 3 times. Then he understood. The manual was not a guide. It was a warning. And the realization filled him not with hope, but with rage, because understanding came too late, and silence, once learned, could never be unlearned. The man who understood the warning did not react immediately. That was the first lesson the manual taught him, though it never said so directly. Reaction was a luxury. Reaction was sound. Silence was survival. His name was Pavel Mihailovich, though he no longer used it in his head. Names created attachment, and attachment created noise. He folded the thin manual carefully, smoothing the creases with the precision of someone who once worked with delicate instruments, and slid it beneath his mattress. Around him the barracks breathed an uneven rhythm, dozens of men synchronizing unconsciously to the same unspoken rule: exist quietly enough to avoid attention, but not so quietly as to disappear. Pavel had arrived 3 weeks earlier, long enough to learn that this camp followed the same logic as the others and yet felt different. There were fewer beatings. Fewer shouted orders. The guards watched more than they acted. Men were summoned and returned altered, not limping, not bruised, but hollowed, as if something essential had been removed with surgical care. When Pavel first read the manual, he assumed it was simply another instrument of control. He had skimmed it dutifully, absorbing phrases about controlled deprivation, adaptive uncertainty, regulated isolation. Then he reached the passage that stopped him. It described silence not as a weapon, but as a mirror. The sentence suggested that prolonged silence did not erase thought. It amplified it. That the human mind, deprived of external reference, turned inward until contradictions multiplied beyond endurance. Then came the line that made his pulse quicken. Despite all his training to suppress such things, excessive application leads not to compliance, but to unpredictable resistance patterns. Unpredictable was not a word used lightly in such texts. From that moment, Pavel read differently. He began to see the seams, the hesitations, the strange care with which certain limits were described. Someone had written this knowing it could be misused, but also knowing it could be survived. He did not yet know the name Lev Borisovich. He did not need to. The voice was present without a name, embedded in syntax and restraint. Pavel began to listen. He listened not for sound, but for its absence. He noticed how interrogations were scheduled at irregular intervals, how men were kept waiting in rooms with clocks that did not move. He noticed how guards avoided eye contact during prolonged silences, how even they seemed affected by the techniques they enforced. The manual had been right. Silence was not one-directional. Slowly, cautiously, Pavel tested the margins. When left alone, he counted breaths not forward but backward. When asked to wait, he sat with eyes open, focusing on physical sensation rather than thought. When confronted with contradictory orders, he complied with either immediately, allowing the contradiction itself to remain unresolved. It earned him suspicious looks, but no punishment. Unpredictability, he realized, was a shield as well as a threat. Others noticed. In the barracks, a man 2 bunks away began humming without sound, moving his lips in patterns that suggested melody. Another tapped sequences on his knee, irregular enough to avoid detection but structured enough to anchor the mind. These were not taught openly. They spread the way silence did, invisibly. Months passed. The camp continued its work on the non-existent structure. Concrete was poured for foundations that would never hold anything. Measurements were taken, revised, discarded. The project existed only to require obedience. One evening Pavel was summoned. The interrogation room was smaller than he expected. There was no lamp this time, only diffuse light from a window coated in ice. The officer did not sit immediately. He walked behind Pavel, slowly, deliberately, his boots making no sound on the floor. "You have adapted well," the officer said finally. It was not praise. It was diagnosis. Pavel remained silent. "We are considering expanding the program," the officer continued. "Your observations would be valuable." There it was. The same offer, reshaped for a new generation. Participation disguised as necessity. Refusal disguised as consequence. Pavel thought of the manual under his mattress. Of the careful warnings folded into official language. Of the man who had written them knowing he might never be heard directly. He spoke. "I observe that prolonged uncertainty reduces efficiency," he said calmly. "Men begin to conserve energy in ways that are difficult to reverse." The officer nodded. Made a note. Encouraged, Pavel continued, choosing his words with care. He spoke of diminishing returns. Of system fatigue. Of the danger of creating thinkers where obedience was desired. Everything he said was true. Everything could be ignored. When he was dismissed, he returned to the barracks shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of controlled speech. He lay awake that night, not listening to silence, but shaping it. Weeks later, the schedule changed. Interrogations shortened. Waiting periods were reduced. The machine adjusted, not out of mercy, but out of self-preservation. Pavel never learned what became of him in official records. One day his name was not called. Another man took his place in line. The camp continued. Years later, in a different facility, another manual circulated. Thinner. More refined. It quoted no authors. But in one paragraph, almost invisible, was a sentence about silence as a mirror. And somewhere, far from the camps, in a city that had learned to be loud again, an old man who no longer spoke much heard a radio broadcast about advancements in behavioral science. He turned it off gently, before the sound could settle. Silence, he knew, was never empty. It remembered. Silence did not end with the camps. That was the final truth neither Lev Borisovich nor Pavel Mihailovich had fully understood while inside them. Years after Pavel disappeared from the roster, the manuals stopped circulating in their original form. They were revised, condensed, laundered of cautionary language. The warnings were softened into recommendations. The margins were cleaned. Ambiguity, which had once been a flaw tolerated by the system, was identified as a vulnerability. But systems, once taught to listen, never forget completely. In a research institute far to the south, long after the snow-bound sites were abandoned and reclassified, a young linguist named Anna Sergeyevna was assigned a peculiar task. She was to analyze archival documents on behavioral compliance, comparing early and late formulations for inconsistencies. It was bureaucratic work, intended to justify funding, nothing more. On her third day she noticed something strange. Certain phrases appeared, disappeared, then reappeared decades later with altered terminology but identical structure. Not slogans. Not ideology. Rhythm. The cadence of sentences suggested pauses that were not marked. Instructions that assumed the reader would stop at specific points. Anna Sergeyevna read aloud quietly, then stopped herself. She read again, silently this time, and felt an odd pressure behind her eyes as if the text were asking something of her rather than informing her. She traced the lineage backward. The earliest version was incomplete, damaged by moisture. The author field was blank. The date was smudged, but the archivist's stamp spelled out a year in the late 1930s. The location was listed as Administrative North, an intentionally vague designation. She requested additional files. The clerk looked at her strangely but complied. That night Anna Sergeyevna dreamed of rooms with no clocks and men who waited without moving. She woke angry, though she could not say why. Anger, she would later realize, was what remained when fear had been exhausted. She returned to the institute and continued her analysis, but something had shifted. She began annotating not just differences, but absences. Where later texts removed caution. Where silence was no longer described as unstable. Where unpredictability had been reframed as success. At a meeting she raised a question. "What happens?" she asked carefully. "When the subject internalizes the method?" The room was quiet. Too quiet. Her supervisor smiled and redirected the conversation. Afterward he suggested she take leave. She declined. The suggestion became an instruction. At home, Anna Sergeyevna began writing her own notes. Not reports. Not criticism. Maps. She mapped the evolution of silence as policy. She mapped the moment it ceased to be a tool and became an environment. She did not publish. Instead, she taught. Her students noticed that her lectures had unusual pacing. She allowed questions to hang unanswered. She encouraged them to sit with uncertainty rather than resolve it immediately. Some were uncomfortable. Others became alert in ways education rarely produced. One student asked her why she did this. Anna Sergeyevna hesitated, then answered honestly. Because systems that rely on silence collapse when people learn how to listen without obeying. The phrase spread quietly. Elsewhere, in an apartment whose address no longer existed on official maps, an old man with a damaged voice listened to the radio and recognized nothing. Not the slogans. Not the confidence. Only the gaps between sentences, where hesitation still lived. Lev Borisovich did not smile. Smiling required an audience. He had learned long ago that resistance did not announce itself. It embedded. It waited. It allowed itself to be mistaken for compliance until the moment misunderstanding became irreversible. When he died, there was no obituary. Only a box of papers passed to a relative who did not understand their value and donated them to a local archive. Years later, Anna Sergeyevna would open that box. She would read the notes, and feel the same pressure behind her eyes. And for the first time, she would not feel alone in the silence. That was when it became dangerous. Danger, Anna Sergeyevna discovered, did not announce itself with threats. It arrived as clarity. The box contained notebooks of different sizes, filled with a hand that grew steadier as the years progressed. Early pages were dense with formulas, diagrams of sound dispersion, marginal notes about resonance. Later ones shifted. Sentences shortened. White space appeared. Entire pages contained only a single line, centered, as if waiting. She read slowly, the way one reads when speed feels like a mistake. One notebook was devoted entirely to pauses. Not silence, but pauses. Measured not in seconds, but in attention. Lev Borisovich had written that silence imposed from outside created panic, but silence chosen internally created distance. Distance, he argued, was the only defense against systems that required emotional participation. Anna Sergeyevna realized she was reading not research, but a survival manual disguised as theory. The danger lay in the fact that it worked. She tested it on herself. During meetings, she delayed responses by a fraction longer than comfortable. She allowed questions to remain unanswered. She noticed how quickly others filled the gap, volunteering explanations, justifications, concessions. Silence, when not feared, drew truth toward it like gravity. She began to see the pattern everywhere. In political speeches. In classrooms. In domestic arguments. Whoever controlled the pause controlled the outcome. This was not something that could be unlearned. She understood now why the later manuals had tried to erase ambiguity. Why they had flattened language. Why they had removed the mirror. A system could tolerate resistance expressed as noise. It could not tolerate resistance that looked like stillness. Anna Sergeyevna faced a choice she had not expected. Publication would mean attention. Attention would mean distortion, co-optation, neutralization. Silence, on the other hand, could preserve the method, but only for those already prepared to notice it. She chose a third path, not unlike the one Lev Borisovich had chosen decades earlier. She organized a seminar. Officially, it was about discourse analysis. About rhetoric. About the limits of language. Unofficially, it was about pauses. She never mentioned camps. Never mentioned names. She simply structured the space so that students experienced what the texts described. Some dropped out. A few complained. One wrote a report. Nothing happened. That was when she knew it had already spread too far to be easily contained. Years passed. Graduates of her seminar went on to work in journalism, education, administration. None of them spoke of what they had learned directly. They did not need to. They carried it in posture, in timing, in the way they allowed others to reveal themselves. The system adjusted again. It always did. Meetings became louder. Deadlines shortened. Noise was encouraged. Silence was reframed as inefficiency, as disengagement, as threat. But noise could not erase what had been internalized. In a different city, at a different time, a young official sat in an interrogation room designed according to the newest standards. The subject across from him did not speak. Did not avert his eyes. Did not comply, but did not resist. Minutes passed. The official felt sweat on his back. He cleared his throat. He asked a question he had not planned to ask. Outside, observers noted elevated stress indicators in personnel. Recommendations were made. Procedures revised. The manuals grew thicker. Less elegant. More desperate. Silence, once a weapon, had become unstable. The final irony revealed itself slowly, the way all profound failures do. Systems built to exploit psychological weakness had trained generations to recognize manipulation. To wait. To endure. To refuse participation without ever saying no. In the end, there was no collapse. No uprising. No dramatic reckoning. There was only a growing number of people who could no longer be hurried, intimidated, or rushed into belief. And for a system that depended on immediate response, that was unforgivable. Somewhere in an archive, the notebooks of Lev Borisovich rested on a shelf, uncatalogued, their titles misleading, their content dormant. They did not need to be read anymore. The method had escaped the page. Silence had learned how to listen back.